Cynthia was a bright university student with big dreams. She came from a humble home, raised by strict parents who taught her to value education and self-respect. But university life was different. The freedom, the excitement, and the pressure to fit in were overwhelming. Her closest friends, Sandra and Bella, were known for their beauty and extravagant lifestyle. They always had the latest clothes, expensive perfumes, and flashy phones. Cynthia often wondered how they could afford such luxury. One evening, as they sat outside their hostel, Bella laughed and said, "Cynthia, you're too innocent. Look around. Girls like us don't rely on struggling parents. We know how to make men spend on us." At first, Cynthia hesitated. She had always believed in hard work and patience. But as days passed, their words kept ringing in her ears. She noticed how boys looked at Sandra and Bella when they walked across campus in short dresses and high heels. Meanwhile, she felt invisible, ignored, just another ordinary girl. Then, one day, Sandra placed a bundle of cash in Cynthia's hands. "You deserve to enjoy life too," she whispered. "Trust me, it's easy." And that was how it all began. Cynthia hesitated, staring at the crisp Naira notes in her hands. It felt heavy, not just in weight but in meaning. She knew this money wasn't from hard work, it was from something else, something she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of. But Sandra and Bella made it seem easy. Just one date, Bella assured her. A nice dinner, good conversation. No one is forcing you to do anything. Cynthia swallowed her doubts. She had spent years watching her mother struggle to pay school fees. Maybe this was a shortcut to the good life. That night, she wore a short red dress Sandra gave her, applied makeup, and slipped on high heels. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. The man she met at the fancy restaurant was older, in his 40s, with a gold watch and a confident smile. He ordered expensive food and showered her with compliments. Cynthia forced a smile, pretending to enjoy the attention. At the end of the night, he handed her an envelope thick with cash. "That's for you, beautiful," he whispered. Her heart pounded. It was so much money, for just one evening. She told herself it was harmless, but she had no idea she was walking into a nightmare. The envelope in Cynthia's hand felt like a burning coal. It was more money than she had ever held at once. Her heart pounded as she walked back to her hostel, her heels clicking against the pavement. She told herself it was just a dinner, nothing serious. But deep inside, something felt off. Sandra and Bella were waiting for her, their eyes twinkling with excitement. "How was it?" Sandra asked, grinning. Cynthia hesitated, then forced a smile. "It was okay." Bella laughed. "See, easy money. You look stunning and now you're rich." She snatched the envelope and flipped through the crisp bills. "Wow, Cynthia, this man really likes you." Cynthia sat down, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She felt different, yet she couldn't explain why. The next day, she bought new clothes, short skirts, tight tops, and high heels. Slowly, she transformed into someone she barely recognized. She started getting attention. Men turned their heads when she walked past, and the money kept flowing. Then, one morning, something strange happened. When Cynthia stepped out of her hostel, she found a small red envelope on the ground near her door. It had no name, just her hostel number written in neat handwriting. Confused, she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper with just 5 words. "You are the most beautiful." Her heart skipped a beat. Sandra snatched the note from her hands. "Oh, a secret admirer," she teased. "This is getting interesting." Bella giggled. "See, you're now one of us. Mystery men, expensive gifts, this is the life." Cynthia laughed nervously. It's probably just a joke. But deep inside, she wasn't sure. That was only the beginning. Cynthia tucked the letter into her bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling in her chest. It was probably nothing, just a random admirer who found her attractive. But the letters didn't stop. Every morning, she found a new red envelope outside her door. Each note carried a simple but chilling message. "Your smile lights up my world. I watch you from afar. You belong to me." At first, Sandra and Bella found it exciting. "Someone is obsessed with you," Sandra teased. "This is what happens when you become a campus queen." Bella smirked. "Enjoy the attention, babe. Maybe he's rich." Cynthia forced a smile, but deep down, unease crept into her heart. The words felt too intense, too personal. and whoever was sending them never left a name. Then the gifts started coming. A box of expensive chocolates, a bottle of designer perfume, a single red rose. Each gift was left in front of her hostel door, with no sign of who had dropped it. One evening, as she walked back to her room, she had the strange feeling that someone was watching her. She turned quickly, scanning the dimly lit hostel corridor. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't leave. That night, she locked her door tightly and tried to sleep. But in the darkness, her mind whispered a terrifying thought. What if this wasn't admiration? What if this was something much worse? Days passed, and the letters and gifts kept coming. Cynthia pretended to enjoy the attention, but fear gnawed at her. Whoever was behind this knew where she lived. They knew her routine. They were always watching. Then, something happened that made her blood run cold. One evening, after a late night outing with Sandra and Bella, Cynthia returned to her hostel. As she approached her door, she froze. Someone had left a small velvet box on the floor. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Sandra and Bella squealed. "Open it. Maybe it's a diamond ring." Cynthia swallowed hard and flipped the box open. Inside was a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. But that wasn't what terrified her. Inside the heart was a tiny photo of her. A picture she had never taken. Her breath caught in her throat. How did he get this? Bella frowned. "That's creepy. Maybe it's time to find out who this guy is." Sandra waved it off. "Relax, it's just romance. Someone is crazy about you." But Cynthia wasn't convinced. That night, she barely slept. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow looked like a figure standing in the darkness. She wasn't imagining things anymore. Someone was following her, and they were getting closer. Her hands trembled as she picked up the red envelope. The paper felt cold against her fingertips, as if it carried the very chill creeping into her bones. Slowly, she tore it open, her breath hitching as she unfolded the note inside. This time, the message wasn't sweet. It wasn't poetic. It was terrifying. "You look beautiful in class today. I love the way you twirl your hair when you're thinking. Soon, we'll be together forever." Cynthia's knees weakened. She grabbed the door frame to steady herself. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, each beat hammering against her ribs like a warning. This wasn't just a secret admirer. It was someone who had been watching her closely, too closely. He knew her little habits. He had seen her in class. This was no ordinary crush. This was an obsession. Her mind raced. Who could it be? A classmate? A lecturer? Someone from the hostel? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She suddenly felt exposed, like she was standing in the middle of the street with no place to hide. Whoever this person was, they weren't just watching from a distance anymore. They were getting closer. Cynthia turned quickly, scanning the empty hallway outside her room. Was he there? Was he watching her right now? Her breathing quickened. She slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. For the first time since the letters started arriving, she felt truly afraid. She needed to talk to someone. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sandra's number with shaky fingers. The call rang twice before her friend picked up. "Sandra, I need to talk to you," Cynthia whispered urgently. "This is getting out of hand." Sandra groaned. "Not this again, Cynthia." "What now?" Cynthia clenched her jaw. "He saw me in class today. He knew what I was doing, Sandra. He described my movements in the letter." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Sandra sighed. "Cynthia, you're overthinking things. He's probably just some guy crushing on you. Maybe he doesn't have the confidence to talk to you face to face." Cynthia gripped the phone tightly. "Sandra, this isn't normal. It's not romantic, it's creepy. What if he's dangerous?" Sandra laughed lightly. "You worry too much. I told you, this is what happens when you become a campus queen. Men admire you from afar. It's nothing serious." Cynthia swallowed hard. She wanted to believe Sandra, she really did. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This was serious, and it was only getting worse. Cynthia sat on her bed, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sandra's words echoed in her mind, but they did nothing to calm her nerves. How could she be overreacting? This wasn't some harmless crush. It was something far more sinister. Someone was watching her every move, studying her, getting bolder. And Sandra thought it was nothing. Taking a deep breath, she tried to think. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Sandra was right. And this was just some secret admirer who didn't know how to express his feelings. But then why wouldn't he reveal himself? Why keep hiding behind letters and gifts? And most importantly, how did he get that picture of her? Her stomach twisted as she remembered the necklace. It wasn't a random trinket. It had her face inside it, a photo she had never taken. Cynthia's body went cold. What if he had been following her long before she even noticed? What if this wasn't just admiration but obsession? The thought made her feel sick. She needed to do something. But what? Go to the police. Tell the hostel warden. Would they even take her seriously? Her phone vibrated in her hand, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. Did you like my gift? Cynthia's blood ran cold. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her. Her entire body trembled. This was different. The letters had always been left at her door. But now he had her number. He could reach her directly. That meant he was getting closer. Cynthia's heart raced as she stared at the phone on the floor. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel the cold sweat dripping down her back. She didn't want to touch the phone again, but the vibrating screen seemed to taunt her, urging her to face the reality she had been trying to ignore. The message was simple, but it sent chills down her spine. Did you like my gift? For a few moments, Cynthia stood frozen, her mind racing. Who was this person? How did they know her number? How had they gotten so close? Her mind flashed back to all the times she had walked back to her room late at night. The feeling of someone's eyes on her, following her. She had brushed it off, thinking she was just paranoid. But now it was clear. She wasn't imagining things. The man wasn't just admiring her from a distance. He was getting bolder. He was stalking her. Cynthia felt like she couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, and the walls of her small room seemed to close in on her. Every corner felt like it was hiding something, or someone. She backed away from the phone, her heart pounding in her ears. The silence in her room became deafening. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the blood rushing in her ears, louder than the buzzing of the phone. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run somewhere safe. But where could she go? There was no escape. Not when he knew where she lived, where she studied, and now, how to reach her directly. In a panic, Cynthia rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back. Her eyes scanned the dark courtyard below. The lights from the street lamps flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty ground. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing near the entrance to the hostel. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she looked again, there was nothing. It had to be her imagination. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting. Her phone buzzed again, and she jumped back in fright. The message was waiting for her. You're beautiful when you're scared. A cold shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't just a person infatuated with her. This was a predator. Cynthia's eyes filled with tears as she clutched her phone in her hands. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to tell someone, anyone. But she couldn't bring herself to dial Sandra or Bella again. They didn't believe her, and she didn't want to seem crazy. She had to handle this herself. But as she looked around the room, the fear started to creep in. Could she handle this alone? The door to her room creaked. Cynthia froze. The fear in her chest spiked to an unbearable level. The door had been locked. Had she left it unlocked by mistake? No. She was sure she had locked it. With trembling hands, she slowly stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she should do, what she could do. But before she could take another step, the door handle turned. Who's there? She whispered, her voice barely a sound. No answer. But the door creaked again. She held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. It felt like the room was spinning. Her head was foggy, and every noise felt amplified. The door was opening slowly, as if whoever was on the other side was taking their time, savoring her fear. Cynthia stepped back, her hand reaching for her phone to call for help, but the screen was black. It had turned off. She could barely think straight. What was happening? Was this the end? Was this man inside her room? The door swung open fully, but no one was there. Cynthia's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the open door. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her body refused to cooperate. It was as if the world had frozen around her, and she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape from. The room was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamps outside, casting eerie shadows across the floor. She could see nothing at first. The hallway outside was empty. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. The kind that made you feel like something was about to happen. Something terrible. Cynthia's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might explain the door opening. Had she forgotten to lock it? No. She remembered clearly locking it. The door had been secure when she stepped inside. Her thoughts raced, spinning wildly in every direction. The voice in her head was telling her to leave, to run to safety, but her legs were rooted to the floor, her body too terrified to move. She couldn't let herself believe it, but the truth was sinking in. She wasn't alone in this room. She wasn't safe anymore. She reached for the door handle and yanked it shut with all her strength, then locked it again. But the creeping dread didn't go away. Whoever had opened that door was still out there. They were still watching her. The thought made her stomach churn. Suddenly, her phone vibrated on the bed, and her heart nearly stopped. The screen lit up with a new message. "I told you you belonged to me." Cynthia's hands were ice cold as she stared at the words. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a harmless admirer, it was a stalker, someone who was obsessed with her, someone who was becoming more dangerous by the second. She had to get help. She couldn't do this alone. But when she reached for her phone again, a new message popped up. "You can't hide from me, Cynthia. I'm closer than you think." The hair on the back of her neck stood up. The fear flooded through her body once more, making her dizzy. Was he already inside the hostel? Was he watching her right now? The thought made her blood run cold. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in her haste, her mind frantically searching for any possible escape. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a picture. The image was dark, blurry, but it was unmistakably her. She recognized her own face in the photo, but the background was strange, unfamiliar. It looked like it had been taken in her own room. "No." The message followed quickly after. "I see you. I'm always watching." Cynthia's eyes were wide with terror as she turned, scanning the room for any signs of movement. Could it be possible? Could someone really be in her room, hiding in the shadows, watching her every move? She couldn't think straight. Her mind was racing, and her body was locked in a fight or flight response. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, and her breath came faster as panic set in. She ran to the window, trying to pull the curtain aside, but her hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't get a good grip. The cold air hit her face as she forced the window open, hoping to call out for help, but the campus was too far away, too quiet. Her voice felt trapped in her throat. No one would hear her. A sudden noise from the door behind her snapped her head around. The door. She hadn't locked it. Her heart leaped into her throat as she turned to face the door, fear gripping her every nerve. It was slightly ajar, but no one had entered. Not yet. The silence in the room was now suffocating. She had to act fast, had to get out of there before it was too late. But how? She took one last look at the door, then bolted for the window, not knowing where she would go or who she could trust. Her only focus was escape, but just as she was about to climb through the window, she heard a faint sound. A soft whisper. "I told you you belonged to me." She froze. The voice came from inside the room. Cynthia's heart stopped. Her breath hitched in her chest as the whisper echoed in her ears. She wanted to scream, but the terror in her chest left her paralyzed, unable to move. She slowly turned around, her eyes wide with panic, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Yet, the voice lingered in her mind. It felt as though it was inside her head, breathing down her neck, sending cold shivers up her spine. The realization was too much to bear. He was in the room. He was already here. Cynthia's eyes darted around frantically, trying to find any sign of the person who had been tormenting her. The room was still, deadly still. She moved cautiously toward the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She didn't dare look behind her, afraid that if she did, she would see something. Someone standing there in the shadows, waiting to strike. Suddenly, the door creaked. Cynthia's entire body went rigid, her heart leaping into her throat. She had been too slow. He had been waiting for her to make a move. A shadow moved quickly across the floor, and Cynthia gasped. She had to run. But just as she took a step forward, she heard a loud, sharp knock at the door. "Cynthia," the voice said low and menacing. "Let me in." The knock at the door echoed through Cynthia's entire body. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it might burst from her chest. The voice, low, smooth, and cold, sent a shiver down her spine. "Let me in." Her legs felt like jelly. She could barely stand. What should she do? Should she scream? Should she hide? But there was nowhere to hide. Her room was small, and it was clear now that this person knew exactly where she was. They had been watching her. They had been waiting for this moment. The door was locked, but she knew it wouldn't stop him. He would find a way in. Cynthia backed away from the door slowly, her heart racing. There was no escape, no way out. She couldn't stay here any longer. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run for help, but the terror made it hard to think clearly. She glanced out of the window, hoping for a miracle, but all she saw was darkness. The campus was deserted, no sign of anyone who could help her. She was alone. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by the same chilling voice. "Cynthia, you can't hide from me. I'll find you. Let me in." Tears blurred her vision as she stepped back further into the room. Her fingers tightened around her phone. She needed to call someone. She needed help. But what could they do? What if it was too late? What if he was already inside? Suddenly, she heard a sound, soft at first, then louder. The door handle was turning. She stared at it in horror. He was trying to get in. Desperation surged through her. She picked up the nearest object she could find, her desk lamp, and clutched it tightly, ready to defend herself. But as she stepped forward to the door, the voice spoke again. "You don't need that. I'm right here." Cynthia froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. He was here. He was already in her room. She could feel it now, the presence of someone standing just out of sight. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the room were closing in on her. She turned, expecting to see him, but there was nothing. No one. She let out a shaky breath, wondering if she had imagined it. Maybe she had been hearing things. But then she heard it again. "I'm right behind you." A cold hand brushed against her shoulder. Cynthia screamed and whirled around, swinging the lamp wildly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Her eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, but she couldn't see anyone. But then the door creaked again, and this time it slowly opened. Cynthia's breath hitched in her throat. She had locked the door. She was sure of it. Her phone buzzed again. A new message from the stalker. "I told you you belonged to me." She couldn't take it anymore. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision as she ran toward the door. The only thing that mattered was getting out, getting away from the person who had been tormenting her for so long. But as she reached for the door handle, it suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang. Cynthia screamed in terror. Her entire body was shaking, and her mind was spiraling. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in on her. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. She couldn't escape. The door opened again, but this time, someone stepped into the room. It was him. Cynthia's heart stopped as she looked at him. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could see the silhouette of his figure. He was tall, his body blocking the doorway like a shadow. His breath was slow and steady, the only sound in the room. He stepped forward, and Cynthia felt a wave of dread wash over her. "You didn't listen to me, Cynthia," he whispered, his voice almost gentle. "Now you're mine." Cynthia's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, too terrified to move. The figure stepped closer, his footsteps echoing through the room like a countdown to her doom. But just as he reached out to grab her, there was a loud crash. The door burst open, and two of Cynthia's friends, Sandra and Bella, rushed into the room. They had heard the screams from down the hall and had come to check on her. "Cynthia!" Sandra shouted, rushing to her side. "Get away from her!" Bella screamed at the stalker, who was still standing in the doorway. The figure hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted out of the room, disappearing into the shadows of the hostile corridor. Cynthia lay on the floor, trembling, unable to move. Her friends knelt beside her, trying to comfort her, but the fear still gripped her heart. The stalker was gone, but the terror would never leave her. Cynthia's mind was still racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Sandra and Bella helped her sit up. their faces filled with concern. They kept asking her if she was okay, but the words didn't seem to register. The terror she felt was all-consuming. She was safe for now, but what about tomorrow? What if he came back? Her body trembled uncontrollably as Sandra held her close, trying to calm her. Bella had already pulled out her phone to call the campus security, but Cynthia barely noticed. Her eyes were wide, her gaze still fixed on the door that had been opened so easily, the door that had allowed the nightmare to enter. It had all been too much. She had never imagined that something like this could happen. She had thought the love letters and gifts were just harmless attention. She had thought she was just being admired by someone who liked her, but now she realized just how wrong she had been. The dangerous obsession, the creepy messages, the constant watching, it had all been leading to this moment. She had been a target all along. Are you sure you're okay? Bella's voice brought her back to reality. Cynthia nodded weakly, still in a daze. The seconds ticked by like hours as they waited for security to arrive. They spoke to her softly, reassuring her that everything would be fine. But even though their words were kind, they didn't ease the weight in Cynthia's chest. How could everything be fine when the person who had been tormenting her was still out there? What if he decided to come back? What if he was watching them right now? It wasn't long before campus security arrived, and they quickly swept through the building, making sure everything was secure. They questioned Cynthia, asking her to explain everything that had happened. But the words felt so distant, so hard to say. How could she describe the fear she had felt, the coldness that had gripped her heart? How could she explain that the stalker had been so close, so dangerously close? As the officer spoke to her, Cynthia couldn't help but think about all the times she had been careless. The way she had ignored her instincts, the way she had let herself be led down a path she should never have taken. If she had just been more careful, if she had listened to the warning signs, maybe none of this would have happened. But now it was too late. The damage was done. The police couldn't find any evidence of the stalker's presence inside the building. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no clues that could help track him down. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. But Cynthia knew the truth. He was still out there. She had to face it. The stalker wasn't going to stop. He wouldn't just leave her alone. He had already crossed a line, and she knew he would do whatever it took to make her his. She glanced at her friends, who were still standing by her side, their faces full of concern. She could see the worry in their eyes, but she knew they couldn't protect her from this. They couldn't stop him. That night, as Cynthia lay in her bed, the silence of the room was deafening. She could hear the faint sounds of her roommates in the hallway, laughing and chatting, but they seemed so far away. She felt like she was in a completely different world, a world where she was trapped, alone with her fear. She had tried to sleep, to close her eyes and pretend like everything was normal, but every time she closed them, all she could see was the figure in the doorway. The dark silhouette that had haunted her thoughts. The voice that had whispered to her, sending chills down her spine. What if he came back? What if he tried to hurt her again? The fear consumed her, wrapping around her like a tight, suffocating blanket. She couldn't think of anything else. She had thought she was safe in her dorm, surrounded by friends and campus security. But the truth was, she wasn't safe anywhere. He could be anywhere. He could be watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched her phone tightly, thinking about the messages. The last one, the one that had been so chilling, felt like a warning. I'm right behind you. Cynthia shuddered at the memory. It felt like he was still there in the room with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stalker was out there, lurking in the shadows, always one step ahead. Suddenly her phone buzzed. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned it over, praying it wasn't him again. But when she saw the message, her heart sank into her stomach. It was from Sandra. Cynthia, be careful. We're not sure, but we think he might be back on campus. Someone saw a figure lurking near the building. Don't go anywhere alone. Stay safe. Cynthia's blood ran cold. The stalker was still here, still watching. Her hands shook as she sent a quick reply, telling Sandra she was okay for now. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't okay. She was far from okay. She was trapped. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and fear. Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that the stalker was watching her every move. Every time she stepped outside, every time she went to class, She felt eyes on her, felt the presence of someone just out of sight. She began to avoid crowded areas, taking back routes, and always keeping her phone in hand, ready to call for help at a moment's notice. Her friends noticed the change in her. They could see the fear in her eyes, the way she jumped at every small sound. Sandra and Bella stayed close, offering reassurance and support, but Cynthia couldn't help but feel that something was missing. The campus had never felt so big, so empty. It seemed like everyone was just going about their lives, but Cynthia couldn't focus on anything other than the constant dread that hung over her. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, Cynthia received another message from the stalker. "I'm closer than you think." Her stomach churned. She had no idea where he was, or how he had found her again, but it was clear now that she was never truly safe. The fear was relentless. The message made Cynthia's heart race. She stared at it, frozen, as if her phone was about to explode in her hands. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her eyes scanned the room. The air felt thick with tension, like something was waiting to happen. But what? Was he really close? Where was he? How did he know where she was? Her mind raced, spiraling into panic. She quickly locked her phone and tossed it onto her bed, trying to convince herself to calm down. But it was impossible. Every time she tried to push the fear away, it came back, stronger than before. She glanced at the window, dark outside, and the quiet of the campus felt suffocating. She didn't want to be alone anymore. Not now, not when the stalker was still out there, hunting her like prey. But what could she do? Who could she trust? It was already late in the evening, and her friends were still out, attending a campus event. She could wait for them to return, but the truth was, Cynthia didn't know if she could survive another night of feeling this scared. The fear gnawed at her, making it hard to focus on anything else. Her door creaked softly, making her flinch. Cynthia quickly turned her head, but no one was there. Her mind began to play tricks on her again. She stood up and walked over to the door, checking the lock. Everything was secure, but it didn't make her feel any better. It didn't stop the anxiety twisting inside her stomach. Her phone buzzed again. She was afraid to look, but somehow her fingers betrayed her. She reached for the phone, her hands shaking. The message was from the stalker again. "I'm watching you." This time, the fear that flooded her veins was almost too much to bear. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows. Had he been watching her all this time? Had he been here, just waiting for her to let her guard down? Her legs felt weak, and she sank down onto her bed, her head spinning. The walls seemed to close in around her, and she could barely breathe. Every little sound made her jump. The silence was unbearable, broken only by her rapid heartbeat and the constant fear in her chest. The lights flickered for a moment, and Cynthia's stomach dropped. Was this it? Was this when he would finally come for her? But then the lights settled, and the room was still. Her breathing, though erratic, began to slow. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was all in her head. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, she couldn't shake the feeling that the stalker was closer than ever. She needed to get out. She needed to leave the room and go somewhere safer. But where? Where was she supposed to go? Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she couldn't stop herself from looking. The message was simple. "Don't think you can hide forever." Cynthia felt a wave of cold terror wash over her. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. The stalker was coming for her. Suddenly, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart stopped. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly breathe, her chest tightening with fear. She sat frozen on her bed, staring at the door, willing herself to stay calm, but the panic was consuming her. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a deep, familiar voice. "Cynthia, I know you're in there. Open the door." Her body trembled uncontrollably. Her mind screamed at her to stay still, to do nothing, but the fear was so overwhelming she couldn't move. The voice was calm, too calm. It sent shivers down her spine. She could feel the darkness behind that voice, the malice, the obsession that had been building up since the first love letter. She knew without a doubt that this was it. The stalker had found her. "You don't need to be scared," the voice continued, like it was speaking directly to her heart. "I just want to be with you. Let me in." Tears filled Cynthia's eyes as she scrambled to think. She reached for her phone again, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She needed help, She needed to call the police, but it felt like the seconds were slipping away, like time itself was working against her. She sent a quick message to Sandra, asking her to come back to hurry, but she didn't know if she had enough time. The knock came again, this time with a force that rattled the doorframe. Cynthia stood up, her legs weak but determined. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for him to break in. She grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy book, and held it tightly in her hands, ready to defend herself. Her heart was pounding so loudly she couldn't hear anything else. She took a step toward the door, her breath shallow and uneven. The voice spoke again, low and taunting. "I'm right here. You can't hide from me forever, Cynthia." Cynthia's hands shook even more as she slowly approached the door. She could feel the terror creeping up her spine like an invisible force, tightening its grip around her. She had to open it, didn't she? Or was there another way? Was there a way out of this nightmare? Just as she reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps from behind. A noise, a faint rustle that made her freeze. Cynthia's heart raced even faster as the footsteps grew louder behind her. She turned sharply, eyes wide with fear, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The shadows danced on the walls, twisting in the dim light, making her feel as if the room itself was closing in on her. Her mind raced with thoughts. Was this all just a sick game to him? Was he toying with her? Or was he already inside? Had he been watching her from the beginning? The overwhelming sense of being hunted, of being so close to danger, nearly paralyzed her. The knocking at the door continued. Each knock felt like a drumbeat, echoing through her chest, each one a countdown to the moment when she would have to face him. "Cynthia, open up," the voice urged once more. The calmness in it only made the situation worse. Cynthia's thoughts whirled like a storm. Should she call for help? Should she open the door and confront him? Or should she hide and hope that he would go away? None of her choices felt right. Her instincts screamed for her to run, to do anything other than just stand there, waiting for the door to be forced open. Her phone buzzed again, and she jumped, startled. It was Sandra. "We're on our way, hold on," it read. But Cynthia could hardly wait any longer. Every second felt like an eternity. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door, then quickly shoved the book against it, using it as a barricade. She needed time. Time to think, to figure out what to do. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, but she had no time to panic. The knock came again, more forcefully this time, rattling the door. The voice was almost mocking, low and sinister. "I told you I'm not going anywhere, Cynthia." Her breath caught. She took a step back from the door, her eyes flicking around the room, searching for anything that could help her. But there was nothing, nothing but fear. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. The door swung open with such force that the barricade was useless. The book flew across the room. Sandra squeezed her shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong, Cynthia. This was never your fault. You couldn't have known." But it didn't make the guilt go away. Cynthia had been so focused on the attention, on the illusion of love, that she had missed the warning signs. She had been too trusting of people she didn't even know. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Cynthia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it be him? Could he have found her here, too? Sandra stood up quickly. "I'll check it," she said firmly, and Cynthia nodded, too scared to speak. A moment later, Sandra returned with a relieved look on her face. "It's the police," she said. "They've found something." Cynthia's heart leaped in her chest. What have they found? Sandra didn't say anything, but the serious look on her face told Cynthia that it wasn't good news. The police had found something, but it wasn't the relief she'd been hoping for. "They found something," Sandra said quietly, sitting down beside Cynthia again. "They found a recording." "A recording?" Cynthia repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sandra said, "a recording of you. The stalker had been following you for longer than we thought." Cynthia felt the blood drain from her face. The terror in her chest grew even stronger. "What do you mean, following me?" "They've been watching you, Cynthia. From the moment you first met him," Sandra said, her voice full of concern. "He knew everything about you, the places you went, the people you talked to. He even knew when you were alone in your room." Cynthia's hands flew to her mouth in shock. The idea that someone had been following her, observing her every move, made her stomach turn. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if all her privacy had been stolen away from her. The police assured them that they would handle it from here, but Cynthia knew it wasn't over yet. The stalker was still out there. He wasn't done with her, and the fear that had been building in her chest was only getting stronger. The night was long, filled with silence and unease. Cynthia lay awake in Sandra's guest room, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The police had promised to do everything they could to catch the stalker, but Cynthia didn't feel safe. How could she, knowing he was still out there, knowing he'd been following her for so long? Every noise outside made her jump. The wind, the distant hum of traffic, the creaking of the apartment, all of it seemed like a threat. She kept hearing that mocking voice in her head, the one that had sent chills down her spine. "You can't hide from me forever." Sandra had tried to comfort her, but there was only so much that could be done. They had taken all the precautions, locked the windows, bolted the door, and even set up a security system. But nothing made Cynthia feel truly safe. Not while that man, who had once seemed like a romantic figure, was out there obsessed with her. In the middle of the night, Cynthia's phone buzzed again. She had been trying to ignore it, but the persistent buzzing was like a magnet drawing her attention. She reluctantly reached for the phone, her hands still trembling, and looked at the screen. It was a message from the same unknown number. "You can run, but you can't hide. I'll always find you, Cynthia. I'm closer than you think." Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. The stalker knew where she was. He had found her, and now, the nightmare was real. The fear flooded Cynthia's body like a tidal wave. She could barely breathe. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right outside, watching her through the window, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her heart raced in her chest. What was she supposed to do now? Was there nowhere she could go to escape him? She had trusted the police, but this felt like a game of cat and mouse. She tried to steady her hands and text Sandra, but her fingers fumbled on the screen, typing out a message that didn't make sense. "He's close. He knows where I am. Please help." The room seemed to shrink around her, the darkness pressing in on her, as though the stalker was in the very air she breathed. Sandra came rushing into the room, her face pale and concerned. She'd seen the message. "We need to call the police again," Sandra said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We need to make sure they're ready. You're not alone in this, Cynthia." But Cynthia couldn't bring herself to speak. The fear was too overwhelming. All she could do was stare at the phone in her hands, gripped by the suffocating certainty that the stalker was closing in. Sandra stayed by her side, calling the police once again and urging them to increase the patrols around the area. The calm and steady voice on the other end reassured them that help was on the way. But Cynthia wasn't reassured. No matter how many times Sandra told her she was safe, she couldn't shake the feeling that the stalker was watching her every move. The minutes stretched into hours. Cynthia didn't sleep a wink, her eyes glued to the clock as the night dragged on. Sandra didn't leave her side, either, sitting by her with a comforting hand on her shoulder. But even her presence couldn't chase away the dark thoughts that haunted Cynthia's mind. Then, at around 3 a.m., Cynthia heard something so soft, so faint, that at first, she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. A knock. 3 quick, sharp knocks coming from the apartment door. Her blood froze. Her whole body went still. The room felt smaller, colder. The stalker had come. Sandra, too, was frozen in place. Both women stared at the door, the knock echoing in the silence. "It's him," Cynthia whispered. Her voice was barely audible, as though speaking too loudly would summon him. They both sat there, unsure of what to do. Was it really him? The police had said they would keep watch, but what if he had slipped past them? What if they were too late? The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a low, guttural voice. Cynthia opened the door. Cynthia's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Sandra, wide-eyed, her voice cracking as she spoke. "What should we do?" Sandra grabbed her phone, quickly dialing the police again. "Don't answer it, Cynthia. They're on their way. Stay quiet." Cynthia nodded, her heart racing so fast she could feel it in her throat. The knock came again, more insistent this time. The stalker was getting desperate. His voice came through the door, low and menacing. "I know you're in there. Open up. You can't escape me." Sandra pulled Cynthia to the corner of the room, pressing her into the shadows away from the door. "We need to be quiet," she whispered. "We'll wait for the police. They'll be here soon." Cynthia nodded, but every fiber of her being screamed to run. To do something, anything, to get away. The idea of facing him, of seeing that twisted smile again, was almost too much to bear. But as she huddled there, hiding in the darkness, something strange happened. The knocking stopped. The voice stopped. The silence grew deafening. Cynthia could barely breathe. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there waiting. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with tension. Suddenly, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and Cynthia felt a tiny sliver of hope. The police had arrived, but was it too late? The sound of the sirens was a lifeline, a beacon of safety in the growing chaos. Cynthia squeezed Sandra's hand, feeling the tremor in her friend's fingers as they both waited for the police to arrive. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Each second stretched on, every noise outside making their hearts race. The knocking had stopped, but Cynthia knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The stalker was out there, and even if the police had arrived, Cynthia wasn't sure she could trust that he'd just disappear. Minutes later, there was a loud knock at the door, not like the stalker's, but the official, commanding knock of the police. Sandra rushed to open it, and a pair of uniformed officers stood in the doorway. "We're here to help," one of them said, his voice firm. "Is she okay?" Cynthia barely managed a nod, but she could feel her knees shaking. One of the officers glanced around the apartment, his eyes scanning for any signs of the stalker, while the other spoke with Sandra, asking about the events that had led to this terrifying night. "We need to make sure he's not still here," the officer who had been surveying the apartment said. "Stay with us, and don't open the door for anyone else." The officer's words did little to ease Cynthia's nerves. What if the stalker was already inside? What if he was hiding somewhere, watching them, waiting for the right moment? Cynthia's heart thudded in her chest as the officers began to search the apartment. She clung to Sandra, unable to stop shaking. Every corner seemed to hide some new danger, every shadow playing tricks on her mind. "Are you sure you don't know who this man is?" one of the officers asked again. "Any idea why he would target you?" Cynthia shook her head. She had no answers. She had been so caught up in the illusion of romance that she hadn't thought to question the gifts or the letters. Now they seemed like the worst kind of trap, a carefully crafted ruse that had lured her in. The officers moved quickly, their professional demeanor filling the space with a sense of urgency. The more Cynthia thought about it, the more she realized how close she had come to something far worse than a stalker. The man had been obsessed with her, willing to go to great lengths to get her attention. What if he hadn't been stopped? What if he had gotten into her apartment earlier? The possibilities were terrifying. Sandra was still by her side, whispering comforting words, but Cynthia was too afraid to hear them. She felt trapped, as though she were still stuck in the nightmare that had started with a few innocent letters. She had learned the hard way that some kinds of love were more dangerous than anything else. It was hours before the police had finished their search of the apartment, and even then, they couldn't find any sign of a stalker. He was gone. For now. But that didn't mean he wouldn't come back. "We'll increase the patrols around your area," one of the officers told them. "And we'll keep an eye on the person we suspect. If he contacts you again, don't hesitate to call." Cynthia nodded numbly, but she couldn't shake the fear that gripped her heart. The stalker was still out there. He could be watching her right now. And when the police left, what would stop him from trying again? Sandra led her to the couch, where she sat down in a daze, her hands clasped tightly together. She wanted to feel safe, to feel like everything would be okay. But the thought of the stalker still lingering in the back of her mind made it impossible to relax. "I can't believe this is happening," Cynthia whispered, staring into space. "How did it get this far? How did I not see it?" Sandra rubbed her back gently, trying to comfort her friend, but even she didn't have the answers. What had started as innocent attention had turned into something terrifying. The next few days were a blur for Cynthia. She couldn't return to her dorm. The thought of being alone in that place made her stomach turn. Instead, she stayed with Sandra, who insisted on being there every step of the way. But even with her friends and the police involved, Cynthia couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, every time she picked up her phone, the fear gripped her. The stalker's words echoed in her mind, "I'll always find you." Sandra had been trying to help her move forward, offering distractions and support, but Cynthia couldn't shake the memories. She couldn't forget how close she had come to something far worse than a secret admirer. The stalker hadn't just been interested in her, he had been obsessed. The letters, the gifts, the way he had learned everything about her, it was all part of his twisted plan. Cynthia had been so blinded by the attention that she hadn't seen it. She had mistaken obsession for love. One afternoon, as Cynthia sat in the living room, she received another message. Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. "I told you, Cynthia. I'll never leave you. I'm always watching. You can't hide from me." The words sent a jolt of terror through her. Was he really watching her? Was he outside the apartment, waiting for her to slip up? Cynthia's hands shook as she passed the phone to Sandra, who read the message aloud. Sandra immediately called the police again, but Cynthia didn't feel comforted. She couldn't escape the feeling that this was just the beginning. The stalker wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. She had been so naive, so trusting of the attention he had given her. Now, she realized the importance of being cautious, not just with strangers but with those around her who might not have the best intentions. Sandra hugged her tightly, trying to reassure her, but Cynthia knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The following days were filled with unease. Cynthia couldn't escape the haunting thought of the stalker's words. He had promised to find her, and now, each day that passed without another message felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when he would strike again. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowds whenever she stepped outside. Sandra tried to reassure her, but nothing could quiet the storm of fear in Cynthia's heart. Even the smallest things triggered her anxiety. A man walking too close behind her on the street, a car slowing down near her apartment, a shadow flickering across her window at night. Every sound was a potential threat. It was as if her world had shifted, and everything she once took for granted now seemed dangerous. Sandra stayed by her side, supporting her through each sleepless night. But even her comforting presence couldn't shield Cynthia from the overwhelming fear. The stalker's grip on her life was tight, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending to be okay. One evening, a week after the last message, Cynthia decided to leave Sandra's apartment. She was tired of hiding. She couldn't live in constant fear, and she needed to regain some sense of control over her life. Sandra tried to stop her, but Cynthia insisted. She couldn't keep running forever. With trembling hands, she packed a small bag and headed out. Sandra's worried voice followed her, but Cynthia was determined to take a step toward normalcy, no matter how small. She wanted to feel like herself again, to feel free from the chains of fear that had kept her captive. As she walked down the street, her heart raced. She kept her head low, trying to avoid attracting attention, but every sound made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The city seemed bigger now, darker, more threatening. Then, suddenly, she felt a chill in the air, a feeling she hadn't had before. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, like something was about to happen. Cynthia glanced around, her heart skipping a beat as she spotted a figure standing under a streetlight at the corner. She couldn't make out his face, but the way he stood, motionless, made her skin crawl. Cynthia's instincts screamed at her to turn and run. She could feel her body freeze as her eyes locked onto the man's figure. She didn't know if it was him, but everything inside her told her to get away. She took a few steps backward, her feet heavy with the weight of fear. The figure remained still, his posture unnervingly calm. Cynthia's breath hitched in her chest as she backed away slowly. She could feel her heart thundering in her ears. Was he following her? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? Her mind raced, wondering if the stalker had found her. But she didn't want to panic. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. She turned on her heel and quickly walked in the opposite direction, her pace quickening. She wasn't going to look back. But as she hurried down the street, she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her, steady, following her every move. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. She quickened her steps, heart racing. She had to get to safety. She couldn't let him catch her. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. Panic set in. She couldn't see him, But she could feel him. He was there, lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. Her mind spun, and all she could think about was getting to safety. With every step, the fear consumed her. The street seemed longer, the shadows darker. She didn't know where to go. She needed help, but the thought of reaching out seemed impossible. Would anyone believe her? Could she outrun him? Her feet ached, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, a hand gripped her shoulder. She froze. Her heart stopped, and for a moment, everything seemed to go silent. She didn't dare turn around. She couldn't. But she knew it was him. She could feel it in her bones. The stalker had found her. Cynthia. The voice whispered, soft and cold. It sent a shiver down her spine. She whipped around, her eyes wide with terror. And there he was, standing in front of her, his face shadowed under the brim of a baseball cap. The same man from the letters, the same man who had made her life a living nightmare. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling mix of obsession and madness. Cynthia's mind went blank. Her body was frozen in fear. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. He reached out for her, his hand outstretched. She felt her stomach drop as she took an instinctive step back. "I've been waiting for this moment, Cynthia," he said, his voice low and chilling. "You can't run from me anymore." The air seemed thick with dread as the stalker stepped closer to her. Cynthia's heart pounded, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She couldn't think. She didn't know what to do. She had no escape. Before she could react, a car screeched to a halt beside them, the headlights blinding them for a moment. The stalker froze, his eyes narrowing at the car. "Cynthia!" It was Sandra's voice. She had followed Cynthia, never trusting that she was truly safe. Sandra rushed out of the car, her face pale with worry. "Get in the car, now!" Without thinking, Cynthia bolted toward Sandra, her legs moving before her brain could catch up. The stalker lunged after her, but before he could reach her, Sandra slammed the car door shut, and they sped off, leaving him standing there, his mouth open in disbelief. Cynthia leaned back in the seat, her body shaking with adrenaline. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps as the car sped away from the danger. She had escaped. For now. The car sped through the streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Cynthia could hear her heartbeat thudding in her chest, matching the rhythm of the tires on the road. Sandra kept glancing at her, her expression filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Sandra asked, her voice soft yet full of worry. Cynthia couldn't answer immediately. Her mind was still racing, replaying the terrifying encounter. She had barely escaped. She still couldn't believe how close the stalker had come to getting her. It had felt like the world was closing in on her, and the only thing she could think about was how lucky she was to be out of his grip. "No," Cynthia finally whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm not okay." He was right there. He was going to. "Don't think about it, Cynthia," Sandra interrupted, her voice firm. "We're safe now. We're going to stay safe. I'll make sure of it." But the words barely registered in Cynthia's mind. The danger wasn't gone. The stalker had promised he would never leave her. What if he had other plans? What if he was waiting for the right moment to strike again? As they drove toward the nearest police station, Cynthia tried to steady her breathing. The terror still gripped her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let this man control her life any longer. She had to fight back. She had to be strong. At the police station, Cynthia and Sandra were met by the same officers who had responded to the apartment. They had heard the story of the stalker's pursuit, and they wasted no time in taking action. One officer sat with Cynthia, taking down every detail, every moment of the encounter, as she recounted the terrifying experience. The officer nodded, his face serious. "We'll make sure to increase patrols around your area," he said, his voice reassuring, but Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. The stalker knew where she lived, he knew her routines. He had already proven that he could find her. "I want you to stay at a safe location for a while," the officer suggested. "This man is dangerous, and we need to catch him before it escalates further." Cynthia nodded, her eyes distant. She didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not until she knew the stalker was behind bars, locked away where he couldn't hurt her or anyone else. Sandra squeezed her hand gently, offering silent support. Cynthia needed that more than anything right now, someone who believed in her, someone who wouldn't leave her alone in this nightmare. The days that followed were filled with anxiety. Cynthia stayed with Sandra, refusing to go back to her apartment. It didn't matter that the stalker hadn't contacted her again. The fear still lingered. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe, to think, to feel safe. She couldn't sleep without the lights on. She couldn't walk outside without checking behind her. Every knock on the door made her jump. Even the smallest noises in the night sent her into a panic. And then one evening, as Cynthia and Sandra sat in the living room, watching TV, the phone rang. Sandra answered it first, her voice calm, but there was an unease in her eyes as she passed the phone to Cynthia. Cynthia's stomach twisted as she took the phone. She didn't know who was on the other end, but her instinct told her that it was him. The stalker. The man who had been following her, watching her, trying to control her life. With trembling hands, Cynthia pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello, Cynthia." The voice on the other end was smooth, almost too calm. It sent chills down her spine. "Who is this?" Cynthia demanded, trying to sound strong, but her voice cracked under the weight of fear. "You know who I am," the man said, his tone dripping with an unsettling confidence. "You can't run from me, Cynthia. You can't hide forever." Cynthia felt a knot tighten in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man laughed softly. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was dark, menacing. "I want you to understand, Cynthia. You're mine. You always have been." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to hang up, to escape the conversation, but something held her there. Something in the way he spoke made her feel like there was no way out. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice trembling with fear but also defiance. "I'll never be yours." "Of course you will," the man replied, his voice growing colder. "In time you'll see. You'll understand." And with that, the line went dead. The phone call left Cynthia frozen, staring at the receiver as if it might somehow offer an explanation. He wasn't done. The stalker had made it clear he wouldn't stop until he had her. The fear was overwhelming, but she knew something had to change. Sandra took the phone from her, her face hardening with determination. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice tight with anger. "We're going to the police right now." Cynthia nodded, her mind still reeling from the conversation. The stalker's words echoed in her ears. "You're mine." She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let him win. As they drove to the police station, Cynthia's thoughts raced. What if this was all some twisted game to him? What if he was waiting for the perfect moment to make his move? The thought of facing him again terrified her, but she couldn't stay paralyzed by fear. She had to fight back. She had to take control of her life again. The officer at the station listened carefully to her recount the phone call. After taking the details, he gave them a grim look. "We're going to escalate this," he said. "We're putting this on a higher priority." Cynthia's heart was pounding as the officer assured her they would take more action. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the fear that had been consuming her for days. The officer promised that they would track the phone number and gather more information, but Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't end easily. It was like the stalker was always one step ahead of them, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't catch him. Sandra stayed by Cynthia's side, offering comfort, but even she couldn't stop the creeping dread that seemed to cling to every moment. They couldn't keep running. Eventually, they would have to confront him. Cynthia just wasn't sure if she was ready for that. But as the days passed, the stalking seemed to intensify. Strange, unmarked cars appeared outside the apartment complex at odd hours. She noticed unfamiliar faces in the crowd, people who seemed to be watching her. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey, consumed her every waking moment. Even when she was in the safety of Sandra's apartment, the paranoia wouldn't let go. One evening, as Cynthia sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street below, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows, staring directly at her apartment. Her heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be him, could it? She felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched the figure. It was too far to make out any details, but the way he stood, motionless, gave her the chills. She couldn't be sure, but everything in her screamed that it was him. The stalker was close, too close. In a panic, she stepped back from the window, her mind racing. Should she call Sandra? Should she go to the police? But what if he was already inside the building? The thought made her stomach churn. She couldn't let him find her again. Cynthia tried to calm herself, but the fear was overwhelming. She grabbed her phone, dialing Sandra's number with shaking fingers. The phone rang several times before Sandra picked up, her voice groggy as if she'd just woken up. "Sandra, I think he's here," Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw him outside. I'm sure it's him." Sandra's tone immediately shifted to one of concern. "Stay where you are. I'll be right there." Cynthia hung up the phone, her hands still shaking. She felt like she was suffocating. Every noise, every shadow felt like it was him closing in on her. The minutes stretched on forever as she waited for Sandra to arrive. Then, as if the world itself was conspiring against her, a loud banging on the door jolted her out of her thoughts. "Cynthia," came a low, menacing voice through the door. "I know you're in there. You can't run from me." Cynthia's heart nearly stopped. The voice sent a wave of terror crashing over her. She could hear him. He was right outside, and he knew she was inside. She was trapped. Her mind raced. What could she do? She couldn't let him in. But the door was flimsy. If he wanted to get in, he would. The panic took over, and for a moment she froze. She couldn't think clearly. She was paralyzed by fear. Then, just as the banging grew louder, there was a sudden knock on the other side of the apartment door. It wasn't the stalker, it was Sandra. "Cynthia." Sandra called, her voice frantic. "It's me. Open the door." With trembling hands, Cynthia rushed to the door, unlocking it just as Sandra rushed in. "What's going on?" Sandra asked, her eyes wide with worry. Cynthia turned back to the window, her voice barely a whisper. He was out there. He was standing across the street, and then he knocked on the door. Sandra immediately locked the door behind her and rushed to the window. She scanned the street outside but saw nothing. The stalker was gone, at least for now. "We need to leave," Sandra said firmly. "It's too dangerous to stay here." Cynthia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her things and followed Sandra to the door. They didn't know where they were going, but they had to get out of there. They couldn't stay in a place where the stalker knew exactly where to find them. Sandra led the way to the car, and they quickly drove off, leaving the apartment building and the fear behind. But as they drove through the streets, Cynthia's mind kept returning to the chilling voice outside the door, to the knowledge that the stalker was still out there waiting. The next few days were a blur. Cynthia stayed with Sandra in a safe house, away from the city and the stalker. But even though they were physically away from the danger, Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. Her every move felt watched. Every phone call, every message, every person she saw made her wonder if it was him. The uncertainty, the fear, was becoming unbearable. She didn't know how much longer she could keep running from the stalker. He was always in the back of her mind, lurking, waiting. The police were doing everything they could to track him down, but with no clear leads, Cynthia was left feeling helpless. The stalker had left her with a scar, a constant reminder that no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape him. And then one day, as she sat in the small living room of Sandra's safe house, a package arrived. The note attached read, "I'm waiting, Cynthia. I will never stop." Cynthia's blood ran cold. The stalker was still after her. And now, there was no place left to hide. The package lay on the table in front of Cynthia, the note still in her trembling hand. The chilling words burned into her mind. "I'm waiting, Cynthia. I will never stop." The terror was back, heavier than ever before. The stalker's obsession with her had only grown. He was no longer just watching from a distance. He was getting bolder, more brazen. This wasn't just about love. This was about control. Sandra stood beside her, her face pale with shock. "We need to get the police involved immediately. This has gone too far." Cynthia could only nod, her mind still frozen in fear. The package wasn't just a gift, it was a threat. A promise that the stalker would keep coming until he got what he wanted. She could feel his eyes on her, even though she couldn't see him. He was always there, always watching, always waiting. As Sandra picked up the phone to call the police, Cynthia stared at the package, her mind racing. What did he want from her? Why couldn't he just leave her alone? The questions swirled in her head, but no answers came. The police arrived quickly, their faces grim as they took the package for evidence. They questioned Cynthia, asking her to recall everything, every interaction, every strange occurrence, every moment when she had felt watched. But no matter how many times she told the story, it didn't feel real. It was as if this nightmare was a part of her now, and there was no waking up from it. "We'll handle this, Cynthia," the officer said, trying to reassure her. "We'll put a stop to this." But Cynthia didn't feel reassured. How could she? The stalker had been one step ahead of them every time. How long before he made his move again? How long before it was too late? Her mind kept drifting back to the phone calls, to the night when the voice on the other end had claimed her as his. "You're mine." The words echoed in her ears like a haunting melody she couldn't escape. Over the next few days, the fear didn't let up. Cynthia barely slept, the memory of the stalker's voice keeping her awake, her eyes wide open in the darkness. She knew the police were doing their best, but it wasn't enough. There was no way to predict when the stalker would strike next. She couldn't keep running forever. One evening, as she and Sandra sat in the living room, the phone rang again. This time, Cynthia didn't hesitate. She grabbed the phone, her fingers tight around it as she brought it to her ear. "Cynthia," the voice said, the same smooth, menacing tone she had heard before. "I'm closer than you think. Don't think you can hide from me forever." Cynthia's stomach dropped. She could hear him. He was in the same city, maybe even the same neighborhood. He was getting closer. "I won't let you control me," Cynthia said, her voice shaky but determined. "I'm not yours. You'll never have me." The man on the other end of the line laughed softly. "You'll see, Cynthia. You'll come to me eventually. You always do." The line went dead. The words lingered in Cynthia's mind. "You'll come to me eventually." It was like he knew something she didn't, like he was certain she would give in eventually. That thought was terrifying. Was he right? Was there no way to escape him? Sandra watched her closely, her expression full of worry. "Cynthia, you can't listen to him. He's trying to control you. We need to stay strong. You're not alone in this." But Cynthia wasn't sure anymore. What if Sandra was wrong? What if the stalker was right? She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had said it, "You always do." "I'm not giving up," Cynthia whispered, more to herself than to Sandra. "I won't. But I don't know how to make him stop. How do you stop someone like him?" Sandra didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. They could only wait. Wait for the police to find him. Wait for the nightmare to end. But deep down, Cynthia knew it wasn't just about finding him, it was about surviving. She had to stay strong. She had to hold on. The police worked tirelessly, gathering information, tracing phone records, and analyzing the stalker's behavior. But every day that passed felt like a lifetime to Cynthia. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every new package, every phone call, felt like the stalker was getting closer, like his grip on her life was tightening. Sandra stayed by her side, offering support, but even she could see the toll this was taking on Cynthia. The constant fear, the uncertainty, it was eating away at her. It was hard for Cynthia to focus on anything other than the stalking. Then, one afternoon, Cynthia received a strange message. It was an invitation to meet someone at a public cafe. The note claimed it was from a friend, someone who knew the stalker and wanted to help. But Cynthia didn't believe it for a second. "Don't go," Sandra warned her, her voice full of concern. This could be another trap, but Cynthia was already considering it. Could this be the break she needed? Could this be the opportunity to put an end to this nightmare once and for all? After a long discussion, Cynthia decided not to go. It felt wrong. The more she thought about it, the more she realized it was just another trick. The stalker was trying to lure her into a false sense of safety, just to get close to her again. Instead, Cynthia contacted the police and gave them the message. They told her it was good that she hadn't gone, that it could have been a dangerous setup, but the feeling of being hunted, of being controlled, didn't leave her. It haunted her every waking moment. That night, as she lay in bed, the familiar, menacing voice returned. "You're mine, Cynthia. You always were." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She had to end this. She had to stop him. Cynthia's heart raced as a voice echoed in her mind. The stalker's words were like poison, seeping into her thoughts, drowning out everything else. "You're mine, Cynthia. You always were." No matter where she went, no matter what she did, those words seemed to follow her. The walls were closing in. Every time she thought she was safe, another message, another phone call, reminded her that she wasn't. Sandra tried to comfort her, but Cynthia could feel the weight of the situation pulling her down. It wasn't just about the stalker anymore. It was about her own mind, her ability to stay strong in the face of relentless fear. How much longer could she hold on? She had to do something. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him control her life any longer. It was time to face him, face the fear head-on. But how? The police had made little progress. They had a few leads, but nothing concrete. They couldn't predict when or where he would strike next. It was like chasing shadows. The stalker had become a ghost, slipping through their grasp every time they thought they were getting closer. In the weeks that followed, Cynthia became more and more withdrawn. She stayed inside, refusing to go anywhere. The paranoia was overwhelming. Every sound outside, every unfamiliar face, made her heart leap into her throat. She couldn't live like this forever. She needed to take back control of her life. Sandra tried to get Cynthia to see a therapist to talk about the trauma she was experiencing. But Cynthia was stubborn. She didn't want to talk about it. She just wanted it to stop. She wanted the nightmare to end. One evening, as they sat together, Cynthia looked at Sandra with a determination she hadn't felt in weeks. "I'm going to meet him," she said, her voice steady. Sandra stared at her, shocked. "No. Cynthia, you can't. He's dangerous. You don't know what he'll do." "I don't care anymore," Cynthia replied. "I can't keep running. I have to face him." The decision was made. The stalker had been controlling her life for far too long. It was time to take back her power. She didn't care about the risks anymore. The fear had become a part of her, but so had the need for closure, for the ability to walk away from this nightmare. The police tried to stop her. They begged her not to meet him, to let them handle it. But Cynthia was resolute. She couldn't keep living in fear. She had to face him, even if it meant putting herself in danger. The meeting was set for the following evening. The location was a secluded park on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets where people could see what was happening. It was the perfect place for a predator to strike without being noticed. That night, Cynthia prepared herself for the meeting. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, determination. But she couldn't back down now. She had to see this through. As she walked to the park, her steps echoed in the silence of the night. Every rustling leaf, every creak of the trees, made her jump. She was on edge, her senses heightened. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but there was no turning back now. When she arrived, the park was eerily quiet. No one was around. It was just her and the shadows. Her heart pounded as she walked deeper into the park, looking for any sign of the stalker. And then, from the darkness, she heard a voice. "Cynthia." She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was him, the stalker. He had been waiting for her, watching her every move. "Come closer," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. Cynthia's body shook, but she forced herself to take a step forward. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She had to confront him, to end this once and for all. As she stepped into the clearing, she saw him, the man who had been haunting her life for so long. He was tall, his face hidden in the shadows, but Cynthia could feel his gaze on her. The air between them crackled with tension, a mixture of fear and hatred. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why have you been doing this? What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, his face finally emerging from the darkness. And when Cynthia saw his face, she was struck by a sudden realization. He was no stranger. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. The man in front of her wasn't a random stalker. He was someone she knew, someone she had seen before. It was Jason, one of the students from her university. Her mind raced as she tried to process the truth. Jason had been in her class, had sat next to her in lectures. He had always seemed normal, friendly even. But now, standing in front of her, he was nothing like the person she had once known. He was a monster, obsessed, dangerous, and completely unrecognizable from the man she had once seen in class. "I wanted you, Cynthia," he said, his voice low and cold. "I saw how you were, how perfect you are. You belong with me." The realization hit Cynthia like a punch to the gut. Jason had been watching her all this time, planning every move. She had never suspected a thing. Jason stepped closer, a twisted smile on his face. "I thought if I showed you how much I care, you'd finally understand." You'd finally see that we were meant to be together. Cynthia felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't about love. This was about control. Jason wasn't trying to show her affection. He was trying to possess her. He didn't care about her feelings, her life, her dreams. He cared about his own obsession with her. "You're sick," Cynthia whispered, her voice shaking with fear and anger. "You need help." But Jason's smile only grew wider. "No. You don't understand. You'll see, Cynthia. You'll see that we belong together." In that moment, Cynthia knew that she had to escape. She had to get away from him, before it was too late. Cynthia's heart raced as Jason inched closer. The air was thick with tension, and every step he took toward her felt like the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. His smile was twisted, but there was something colder behind his eyes, something dark that sent a chill through her bones. She couldn't let him get any closer. Her instincts kicked in. She turned quickly, her feet moving faster than her mind could process. She wasn't sure where she was running, but she couldn't stand there any longer, facing the person who had twisted her life into a nightmare. As she sprinted through the park, the sound of Jason's footsteps followed her, echoing in the silence of the night. She could feel him closing in on her. He was fast. She couldn't outrun him forever. Then, as if from nowhere, a voice called out to her. Cynthia. Sandra. Her best friend. She had come. Sandra had followed Cynthia, refusing to let her face Jason alone. She had known something wasn't right. Cynthia's decision to meet him had filled her with dread, but she had done everything she could to stop her. Now, seeing Cynthia running towards her, Sandra knew this was the moment. Cynthia! This way! Sandra shouted, waving her arms frantically. Without thinking, Cynthia turned towards Sandra's voice, her feet carrying her faster than before. The fear still gripped her, but now there was a spark of hope, a chance to escape. She heard Jason's voice behind her, shouting her name, but it was distant, fading with every step. As they reached the edge of the park, Sandra grabbed Cynthia's arm, pulling her into the safety of the nearby streetlights. The chaos of the night, the haunting words of Jason, seemed to fade as the bright lights surrounded them. Cynthia's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her entire body shaking from the fear that had paralyzed her only moments ago. She turned to Sandra, her eyes wide with terror. He's insane, Sandra. He's been watching me all this time. He wasn't just a classmate. He was planning this. Every move, every step. And I didn't even see it. Sandra's face was pale, her hands gripping Cynthia's shoulders tightly. You're safe now. He won't hurt you, Cynthia. You're not alone anymore. We'll make sure of it. But even as Sandra said those words, Cynthia couldn't shake the fear that Jason was still out there, watching, waiting for his next move. The damage had already been done. He had left a mark on her life, one that wouldn't be erased so easily. The police were called, and this time they acted quickly. The officers who had been investigating Jason's behavior now had a direct lead. They had seen the signs, the pattern, but this was the first time they had confirmed the stalker's identity. Jason had been careful, sneaky, but he had underestimated Cynthia. The police set up a search for Jason, scouring the area and checking every lead they could. They interviewed everyone who might have had contact with him, hoping to find more evidence. But it wasn't just about catching him anymore. It was about ensuring that Cynthia could heal, that she could find peace after everything she had endured. That night, Cynthia sat down with Sandra in the comfort of her living room, her mind still racing. The nightmare wasn't over, but it felt like the weight of the world had lifted just a little. I thought I was alone in this, Cynthia whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought no one would understand. Sandra took her hand, squeezing it gently. You don't have to face this alone, Cynthia. I'm here, and we're going to get through this together. The following days were a blur for Cynthia. The fear that had consumed her slowly began to fade, but the memories of Jason's obsession still haunted her. She found herself looking over her shoulder, checking locks, scanning the streets, wondering if he was still watching. But life went on. Slowly, Cynthia started to find moments of peace again. She returned to university, though it was hard to focus at first. The fear was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. But with Sandra's support and the protection of the police, she began to rebuild. She found a new sense of strength in herself. She wasn't the scared girl who had been controlled by a stalker. She had survived. And now, she was determined to take back her life. Weeks later, Jason was arrested. He had been hiding in a nearby town, but the police finally caught up with him. The terror he had caused was finally over, and he would face justice for his actions. Cynthia didn't feel the satisfaction she expected when hearing the news, though. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming her freedom, about healing from the scars he had left on her soul. At night, when Cynthia lay in bed, she didn't think about Jason anymore. She thought about her future. She thought about the relationships she had in her life, the people who had stood by her through it all, Sandra, the police officers, and even strangers who had shown kindness when she needed it most. She knew that life would never be the same. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was stronger than she had been before, and she would never let fear control her again. Cynthia's journey was one of survival, but it was also a lesson, a reminder that people aren't always what they seem. Jason had appeared harmless at first, a fellow student with no indication of the darkness inside him. It was a wake-up call for Cynthia, a reminder to trust her instincts and be cautious of the people around her. But it was also a reminder of the importance of friendship and support. Sandra had been there every step of the way, never leaving her side, never letting her face the fear alone. Cynthia was lucky to have her, and she would never take that for granted. As for the stalker, Cynthia learned that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take away her power. He couldn't take away her freedom. She was in control of her life now, and no one, not even Jason, could ever take that away from her again. As the days passed, Cynthia's life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy, though it was a new normal. The scars from the past wouldn't heal overnight, but Cynthia was learning to live with them. She had the support of Sandra, her family, and even some new friends she had made along the way. They helped her rebuild the parts of herself that had been shaken by the stalker's actions. Still, every now and then, the memories of Jason's voice, his chilling words, would resurface. She couldn't forget the terror she had felt, the way he had manipulated her mind and made her feel powerless. But she refused to let that fear control her life. She knew now that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. She had learned an important lesson, that not everyone who seemed kind or harmless was safe. Some people wore masks, hiding their true intentions behind a smile or friendly words. She would never make that mistake again. It was on a quiet afternoon, several months after the ordeal, that Cynthia received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to her, written in neat, familiar handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the name on the return address. It was from Sandra. Cynthia had no idea why Sandra would send her a letter. She had spoken to her only days ago, and everything seemed fine. But when she opened the envelope and began reading, her heart sank. "Cynthia, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before. I'm so sorry I didn't." The letter continued, but Cynthia's mind was racing. She had no idea what Sandra was referring to. Had she been hiding something from her all along? Cynthia couldn't believe it. The letter felt like a punch to her gut. Sandra had been hiding something from her. After everything they had been through together, after all the trust they had built, Cynthia felt betrayed. She had never imagined that Sandra could keep something so important from her. The letter went on to explain that Sandra had known about Jason's obsession for much longer than she had let on. She had noticed the signs, the stalking, the gifts, the odd behavior, but she had kept it a secret, thinking it would blow over on its own. Sandra admitted that she had been afraid, unsure of how to handle the situation, and had hoped Cynthia would eventually figure it out. "I should have told you," Sandra wrote, "but I didn't. And now I understand if you can't forgive me. But please know, I care about you more than anything. I never wanted this to happen." Cynthia sat in stunned silence, holding the letter in her trembling hands. She had never imagined that Sandra, her best friend, could keep such a secret. The pain of betrayal cut deep, but at the same time, she understood. Sandra hadn't been malicious. She had been afraid of what would happen if she spoke up, afraid of making things worse. Cynthia closed her eyes, her mind swirling with emotions. Betrayal, anger, confusion, but also a sense of understanding. She knew how hard it could be to face the truth, to confront something so dark and dangerous. Sandra had been trying to protect her in her own way, even if it hadn't worked out. "I don't know what to think right now," Cynthia whispered to herself. But I need time to process this. The next few days were filled with an emotional roller coaster for Cynthia. She went back and forth, wondering if she should confront Sandra, if she should try to salvage their friendship. She wanted to be angry, to tell Sandra how hurt she was, but there was a part of her that understood the fear Sandra had faced. Finally, she decided to meet with Sandra. She had to hear her side of the story in person, to get closure, to decide whether their friendship could survive the weight of this betrayal. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe, away from the bustle of university life. When Cynthia saw Sandra, sitting nervously at a table near the window, she felt a pang in her chest. Sandra's eyes were filled with regret, and for a moment, Cynthia wondered if their friendship could ever be the same again. Sandra stood as Cynthia approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Cynthia, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "I should have told you everything from the beginning. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but please understand I never wanted to hurt you." Cynthia took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I don't know what to say, Sandra. You kept something so big from me. How could you do that? I trusted you." "I know," Sandra whispered, looking down at her hands. "I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to make things worse. I thought you would figure it out on your own, but I should have said something sooner. I regret not being honest with you." Cynthia felt the weight of Sandra's words, the sincerity in her voice. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the betrayal, but a part of her knew that holding on to the past would only hurt her more. She had been through so much already. After a long pause, Cynthia finally spoke. "I don't know if we can go back to how things were, but I think I can forgive you. It's going to take time, though." Sandra's face lit up with relief, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Cynthia. You don't know how much this means to me." As the two friends sat there, the tension between them slowly began to dissolve. The past couldn't be erased, but they could move forward together. The days that followed were still filled with challenges. Cynthia struggled with the fear and paranoia that lingered from Jason's stalking, but she also found strength in the support of those who cared for her. She began to rebuild her life piece by piece, and though it wasn't easy, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She continued her studies, focusing on her future instead of the past. Her relationship with Sandra was slowly healing, though it would take time to fully rebuild the trust they once had. Cynthia had learned many lessons through the nightmares she had endured. She learned the importance of trusting her instincts, of being cautious with those who seemed too good to be true. She learned that love and friendship should never come with control or manipulation. And most importantly, she learned that no matter how dark things got, she had the power to take back her life. As Cynthia began to move forward, she started to embrace the life she had once feared losing. Her confidence, though shaken, was growing back, and she learned to take things one step at a time. Slowly but surely, she realized that the best way to heal was by surrounding herself with positive energy, people who supported and believed in her. With Sandra by her side, and a renewed sense of purpose in her heart, Cynthia started to feel like herself again. There were still moments when the fear would creep back in, but she no longer let it control her. She took walks, she laughed with friends, and she allowed herself to experience joy again. Even though the scars of the past remained, she knew that her future was still waiting to be written. One night, while watching the stars with Sandra, Cynthia shared something she had never spoken about before. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that I wasn't enough, that I had to change myself, to be something I wasn't, just to be loved." Sandra listened closely, her face filled with empathy. "You were always enough, Cynthia. You just didn't see it. But you do now, right?" Cynthia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I do now." It wasn't long before Cynthia began to see the world differently. The weight of Jason's obsession was still a part of her past, but it didn't define her anymore. She had learned that real love was about trust, respect, and freedom, not manipulation or control. The relationship she had once longed for with someone like Jason was nothing compared to the one she was building with herself. She also realized the importance of self-love, something she had neglected for so long. She spent time doing things that made her happy, whether it was reading, painting, or simply enjoying a quiet moment by herself. No longer did she feel the pressure to conform or to prove her worth to anyone. The lessons from her ordeal had taught her that true strength wasn't about avoiding hardship, it was about overcoming it. Cynthia was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of the woman she was becoming. As Cynthia walked across the campus that morning, she couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. The fear that had once plagued her was no longer a constant companion. Her posture was different, taller, more confident. She smiled at people she passed, something she hadn't done in months. Life felt lighter, and for the first time, Cynthia was excited about what lay ahead. Her studies were going well, and her friendships had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. She had learned to open up again, to trust people and to allow herself to be loved for who she truly was. The walls she had built around her heart were slowly coming down. One afternoon, as Cynthia sat in the library, Sandra came over with a grin on her face. "Guess what?" she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I got us tickets to that concert you've been talking about." Cynthia couldn't help but laugh. "You're incredible, Sandra. I'm actually starting to think that things are looking up." Sandra winked. "Of course they are. We're a team, remember." A few weeks later, Cynthia found herself sitting in the front row of a concert she had never imagined she'd attend. The music blared, the crowd cheered, and for the first time in ages, Cynthia felt completely at peace. She was surrounded by people who cared about her, people who had been there through the storm, and she knew that no matter what happened, she was never alone. Her mind drifted to the past for a brief moment, remembering the fear and darkness that had once consumed her. It was hard to believe how far she had come since then, but the past no longer held the same power over her. The lessons she had learned had become her foundation, a reminder that no matter how dangerous or painful life could get, she had the strength to survive. And she would continue to survive, thrive even. Cynthia had learned that she was the author of her own story, and no one else could write it for her. The months passed, and Jason was eventually convicted. His punishment was severe, but Cynthia didn't feel relief. The legal process didn't change the emotional scars she had carried for so long. However, she knew that justice had been served, and that was enough for her. She could finally breathe freely, knowing that Jason could no longer harm her or anyone else. As time went on, Cynthia felt her sense of self deepen. The pain from her experience didn't define her anymore, it was just part of her story. She had become someone stronger, someone wiser, and someone who no longer needed to fear the darkness. One evening, as Cynthia sat in the quiet of her room, her phone buzzed. She checked it to find a message from Sandra. "Let's take a trip. Get away for a while and leave all the worries behind." A smile spread across Cynthia's face. A fresh start, she thought. A chance to live life on her own terms, without fear holding her back. The trip was everything Cynthia had hoped for. As she and Sandra explored new places, met new people, and laughed until their sides ached, Cynthia realized something. Life was too short to live in fear. Too short to let the darkness of the past control her present. Every moment was a gift, and she was determined to make the most of it. She learned to live without looking over her shoulder, without wondering if someone was watching her. She had found the courage to move forward, to trust herself again. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and Cynthia was ready to walk it, one step at a time. She would never forget what she had gone through, but it no longer had a hold on her. The lessons of the past had shaped her, but they didn't define her. Cynthia had finally reclaimed her life, and no one, not even Jason, could take that away. The days passed in a blur of new adventures and growth. Cynthia had finally started to feel like herself again, shedding the remnants of her former self, the scared, anxious woman who had once believed she wasn't enough. Now, she was confident, assertive, and determined to live her life without looking back. Her bond with Sandra had grown stronger. The trust that had once been fractured had been rebuilt, piece by piece. They laughed together, shared memories, and made new ones. It felt good to be surrounded by people who truly cared for her. With each passing day, Cynthia realized that friendship, real friendship, was one of the most powerful forces in the world. But even as life moved on, there were moments when Cynthia would think back to that Valentine's Day, the day her life had changed forever. It was a stark reminder of how easily someone's kindness could be a mask for something darker. But she didn't dwell on the past. Instead, she focused on the present, embracing everything life had to offer. One day, While having coffee with Sandra, Cynthia glanced at the time and realized it was nearly Valentine's Day again. She couldn't help but chuckle. Valentine's Day always seems to bring so much drama, doesn't it? Sandra laughed along, shaking her head. No kidding. But hey, look at us now. Much stronger, much wiser. It was a quiet evening when Cynthia received a message on her phone. A simple text from an unknown number. Happy Valentine's Day, Cynthia. You deserve all the love in the world. Her heart skipped a beat. It was innocent enough, but after everything she had been through, the message sent a chill down her spine. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen as she debated whether to reply or ignore it. Her mind raced, remembering the messages and gifts from Jason. The ones that had started out so innocent but had quickly turned into something dangerous. She thought about how easily someone could hide behind a screen, pretending to be someone they were not. But then she stopped herself. No, she whispered. I'm not going to let this fear control me. She erased the message and turned off her phone, deciding to spend the evening doing something that would make her feel safe and at peace. She curled up on the couch, surrounded by the warmth of her apartment and the comforting presence of Sandra, who had come over to hang out. That night, as Cynthia lay in bed, she couldn't help but think about the message again. It wasn't like the others. It didn't feel threatening, nor did it feel like Jason's creepy, obsessive words. But still, there was something in the back of her mind, a tiny whisper telling her to be cautious. She turned to Sandra the next morning. Do you think I'm overreacting? Should I be worried about these messages? Sandra thought for a moment, then shook her head. It's okay to be cautious, Cynthia. It's better to be safe than sorry. But you're different now. You've grown, you've learned how to protect yourself. If someone is genuinely trying to be kind to you, you'll know it. Trust your instincts. Cynthia nodded. She knew Sandra was right, but as much as she wanted to ignore the feeling of unease in her chest, it didn't go away. A few days later, another message arrived. I see you, Cynthia. You look beautiful as always. I hope we can meet soon. The words sent a shiver down her spine. There was something unsettling about the way the message was phrased. It felt too familiar, too personal. Was it just someone who admired her from afar, or was there something more behind it? Cynthia felt a cold sweat forming on her forehead. She showed the message to Sandra, who immediately frowned. This doesn't feel right, Sandra said, her voice low. I think we should report it. Cynthia hesitated. She didn't want to overreact, but she also didn't want to take any chances. They agreed to keep the message documented and alert the authorities just in case. It was better to be safe. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. The messages kept coming, each one more intense than the last. The stalker, whoever they were, seemed to know more about her than they should. The texts started mentioning places she frequented, things she had said to friends, and even small details about her routine that only someone who was watching her closely would know. Cynthia could no longer ignore the fear gnawing at her. It felt eerily similar to the time when Jason had been stalking her. The way the messages seemed innocent at first, only to escalate over time. But this time, Cynthia wasn't going to wait until it was too late. She was prepared. She had learned the signs and she knew what to do. With Sandra's help, they took steps to protect her. They reported the messages to the police, and Cynthia took extra precautions in her daily routine, changing her phone number, avoiding certain places, and being more aware of her surroundings. It wasn't easy, but Cynthia knew it was necessary. The authorities took the situation seriously and began investigating the source of the messages. It wasn't long before they identified the person behind the anonymous texts, a fellow student from her university who had been watching her from a distance. He had been obsessed with her for months, and his fixation had grown dangerous. The revelation shocked Cynthia to her core. How had she missed the signs? How had she allowed herself to feel safe in a place where someone was secretly watching her? But at the same time, Cynthia felt empowered. She wasn't the same person she had been during Jason's stalking. She was stronger, more aware, and more equipped to handle the situation. The police arrested the man, and he was charged with harassment and stalking. Cynthia's heart raced as she learned that he had been following her every move, keeping tabs on her social media and even showing up at places she frequented without her knowledge. The police reassured her that they would take care of everything. And although Cynthia felt a sense of relief, there was still a lingering unease. She had survived one stalker, but now she had faced another. How many more people out there might be watching her? Cynthia spent the next few weeks recovering from the shock of it all. She spent time reflecting on everything she had gone through, how far she had come, how much stronger she had become. She thought about the lessons she had learned. To be cautious, to trust her instincts, and to never let fear control her. She also realized that love should never be forced. Whether it was from a friend, a romantic partner, or a stranger, love should be about mutual respect, trust, and understanding. There was no room for obsession or manipulation in true love. Cynthia knew that her life was her own to live. She didn't need anyone to define her or control her. And as she moved forward, she promised herself that she would continue to live with courage, knowing that she had the strength to face whatever challenges came her way. The story of Cynthia's journey didn't end with her ordeal. It was only just the beginning. She had learned to navigate the complexities of relationships, trust, and personal safety. She had discovered the importance of knowing her worth and setting boundaries. And as she continued on her path, she knew that no matter what came next, she would always have the strength to rise above it. So remember, be cautious of who you trust. Be aware of the people around you, even if they seem harmless. Sometimes, those who seem like secret admirers may have sinister intentions. Always trust your instincts, and never let anyone make you feel unsafe. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Storytime with African Tales for more captivating stories like this. Stay safe, and always remember, true love is built on respect and trust.